Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Olga Ulturgasheva, Senior Lecturer in Social Anthropology at the University of Manchester, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce the third event in this series, presented in collaboration with the British Academy and accompanying the Citi exhibition, titled Arctic Culture and Climate at the British Museum. The subject of the climate justice, with special focus on the Arctic, is particularly close to my heart, as I was born and grew up in a community of Avena reindeer herders and hunters in the northeast Siberia. And I know firsthand that Arctic climate is changing at an accelerated pace. Well, in the last couple of decades, Arctic has been particularly affected by the striking dynamic of rapidly changing weather patterns, gigantic wildfires, rapidly melting permafrost, and unprecedented extinction rate of animals, birds, insects, and plants upon which the livelihoods of indigenous communities heavily rely. What has recently become obvious is that the effects of the dramatic environmental degradation and loss of the Arctic cryosphere will not stay solely in the Arctic, as global feedback to this dynamic will emerge through clusters of environmental disasters simultaneously happening across all continents. Therefore, what is happening in the Arctic will affect everyone in the planet. Yet indigenous peoples, as well as many poorer countries with lower carbon outputs, will be impacted first and more than others. One of the key ways of addressing climate injustice is with the concerted and collaborative global conversation, which includes and gives voice to indigenous peoples. So today I am delighted to welcome our speakers, Dr. Dalee Sambo Dorough, Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and Mr. Deon Shekuza, Youth Advocate for Sustainable Development, and the chair of this event, Professor Paul Ekins, Director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, for the discussion on what is effective climate justice. This will be followed by a short session on question and answers. Please send your questions to us by using the Q&A function in Zoom. Without further ado, let me hand over to Professor Paul Ekins to begin this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Olga, for that introduction, and welcome everybody to this British Museum event in association, as Olga said, with this Arctic exhibition. We're incredibly lucky to have two very eminent and knowledgeable speakers on the subject before us today. I'm going to give you just a few more details about them, although these are on the British Museum website about this event, and so I'm not going to run right the way through the length of them. Dr. Dalee Sambo Dorough is chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, as Olga said. This was an organization founded in 1977 to represent the rights and interests of Inuit throughout Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka, Russia. She is an Inuk from Alaska, and she's been active in international relations, international law, and international human rights law, as well as Alaska Native self-determination. She's closely associated with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She has a PhD from the University of British Columbia, Faculty of Law, and an MA in Law and Diplomacy from Tufts University. She served as an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So I think we can rest assured that she knows what she's talking about. If I can turn then to our second speaker, That is Deon Shekuza. He's a youth advocate working on sustainable development issues, such as the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and the African Union's Agenda 2063, which is a framework for guiding Africa's development in the next 50 years. He's active in the international youth climate movement and forms part of the youth group that co-organized the first ever UN Youth Climate Summit in 2019. And he co-founded the Namibian Youth on Renewable Energy, and he's also very much involved in the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Programme Youth Network. Perhaps I could say it's an especial pleasure to welcome Deon, and one of the great hopeful signs of recent times in the climate movement has been the increasing mobilization of young people. And of course, they're the people who are going to be most affected by what's going on in the climate. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you with us. So I'm going to start by asking each of our speakers the key question that we've gathered here together to think about. And then they're going to talk for about 10 minutes each, and we'll then open it up for Q&A, which means there'll be quite a lot of time for Q&A, because I'm not going to say anything else except the questions that you put in. So please have your fingers poised over the chat function, or however you're going to input your questions, and they will then come to me and I will ask them of our speakers. So that's enough intro. Let's get down to the meat of the matter. The question that I'd ask our speakers to address, just to introduce the conversation, is what is effective climate justice? What is climate justice is a difficult enough question. What is effective climate justice is a more important question, because it speaks to what we can actually do to make climate justice apparent and operative in the world that we live in. So let me turn to you first, Dalee. What is effective climate justice?
Thank you for the question, Paul, and thanks also to the British Museum for the opportunity to participate in this event. Climate justice acknowledges that climate change has differing social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts on diverse peoples, and the effort to remove these inequities in order to address the urgently needed mitigation and adaptation strategies to minimize and hopefully end these adverse impacts is my understanding of climate justice. And given this particular understanding, it's important that the world community knows that our culture is dependent on the land and sea. The sustainability of the Arctic environment and its living resources is crucial for our communities. Our Arctic environment is essential to supporting families and Inuit society and culture overall. Our way of life and the environment are intimately linked. Our spiritual, physical, and mental health are tied directly to our lands and coastal seas. We're a species within this Arctic environment, and this profound relationship is so significant that if you interfere with one element, all other interrelated elements are disturbed. Inuit have known that the climate is changing as far back as the late 1980s. The Arctic environment is unique and plays a fundamental role in global climate and now climate change. Our environment continues to undergo profound, rapid, and unpredictable change. Our communities witness and feel the effects of these changes. Therefore, to achieve effective climate justice, again, the world community must recognize that we are impacted in ways that are different from others, especially across the Arctic, which is warming at now 3 times the rate of other regions of the globe. Clearly, our way of life and our traditional economy of hunting, fishing, and harvesting are at risk. Many of the conditions that our communities face began as far back as first contact and colonization. The gross infrastructure deficit that has plagued our communities for decades include lack of potable water, housing, healthcare facilities, transportation, and many, many other elements. Therefore, when one combines the impacts of climate change, a result of development often determined by actors and actions that are far from our homelands and territory, and the chronic, persistent, discriminatory policies in every field of our lives, identifying the inequities becomes crystal clear. The compounding factors of discriminatory government policy that has prevented us from a direct role in decision-making related to our way of life, the management of our lands and resources, as well as adaptation and mitigation, create significant hurdles. As Inuit, we must directly express how climate change is having dramatic, different social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts upon us. Therefore, we advocate for our people, striving to remove inequities at different scales and working with our communities to develop short and long-term mitigation and adaptation strategies that will help to sustain our unique culture and our way of life. There are significant human rights dimensions related to the implications and impacts of a rapidly changing, warming Arctic environment. These distinct Indigenous human rights dimensions are at the core of climate justice for our communities across Inuit Nunat. When we speak of human rights and climate justice, there is an urgent need to recognize the right of self-determination of our peoples and our status and role in determining the best approach and responses to the climate change impacts. Inuit at the village level are the best persons and are best attuned to apply their knowledge about their surrounding ecosystems and how to best adapt to climate change. International human rights instruments, and in particular, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, must be recognized as a central feature of achieving climate justice. Specifically, in relation to infrastructure impacts due to climate change, decisions about protection in place, managed retreat, and relocation responses must be determined by Inuit within their communities at the village level. In addition, climate change impacts to infrastructure profoundly alter the overall well-being and safety of our community members, as well as our lands, territories, and resources. Lack of comprehensive policy and funding at the national level prevents most communities from being able to protect existing, often substandard infrastructure. For example, there are 574 tribal governments across the United States. It's important to note that 237 of them are in Alaska. Recent studies concerning climate change impacts upon Indigenous communities throughout the US estimate that at least $5.4 billion is needed over the next 50 years to protect existing tribal infrastructure. At present, there is no lead federal funding agency for implementation of protection in place, managed retreat, and relocation of our Indigenous communities. And this is the reality of climate injustice. Given this reality, many of our communities are taking action, working to break down the barriers that do exist. Such barriers include lack of clear national leadership, lack of a comprehensive, coordinated national policy, lack of financial and technical resources, as well as the political space to ensure that our right of self-determination is exercised by our leaders in relation to climate change impacts. As the hosts of this dialogue have stated, it is clear that the only way to address climate injustice is a concerted and collaborative global conversation. Fortunately, based on our work, we are contributing to the global conversation and increasing momentum for climate justice solutions specific to our needs. We are sharing our knowledge, adapting within our communities, working with researchers, and involved in a host of national, bilateral, and international agreements to reduce or eliminate the causes of these changes. Internationally, we have succeeded in concert with other Indigenous peoples on the creation of the Facilitative Working Group to operationalize an Indigenous Peoples platform within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Facilitative Working Group is the newest constituted body within this legally binding treaty and corresponding intergovernmental bodies. In addition, the Inuit Circumpolar Council has actively contributed to the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and specifically their special report on oceans and the cryosphere. We await approval of our recent application for observer status within the IPCC in order to make further contributions. Regionally, we're amplifying our voices within various Arctic Council working groups that concern themselves with the impacts of climate change, from the Conservation of Flora and Fauna Working Group to the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program to the Sustainable Development Working Group. Nationally, we have made contributions to the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report, which we hope will gain the attention of the new administration of President Biden, especially in relation to the funding that is urgently needed to respond to Inuit community priorities. Locally, our communities are increasingly taking steps to advance our perspectives as to how climate change is impacting Inuit, and thusly identifying how climate change can be achieved at the local level. In conclusion, we're heartened by the explicit reference of the IPCC chapter within the Global Warming of 1.5 centigrade report that stated, knowledge from actual human experiences of climate change risks and vulnerability in the context of social ecological systems, development, equity, justice, and governance, and from Indigenous knowledge systems are important now and well into the future. Let us move toward the realization of that future through climate justice, the subject of this dialogue. Qianak, thank you.
Well, thank you indeed for an extremely effective and inspiring opening to that. Lots to follow up on in due course. But before we do that, perhaps we could turn to the second of our two speakers. So that's Deon Shekuza. Over to you. Very different part of the world you come from, of course. But I'd be interested to hear whether many of the issues you think that your communities are facing are similar or different.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'd also like to associate myself with the introductory remarks by Dalee by extending my gratitude to the British Academy and British Museum for having us on this platform. I'll try my best to, do justice to this very quintessential question of effective climate justice. And essentially, when I'm asked what is effective climate justice, the first thing that comes to my mind is basically the art of balancing the scale between the most vulnerable and the most valuable. As we know, in human nature, when calamities strike, we often rush to protect our most valuable assets. And so the question then becomes, and where I come from, through the changes and the impacts that have been coming, we've seen that we're really not that a priority for the global community, but we are a concern. The question of effective climate justice also means bringing hope where there is none, because it's very difficult for people to trust in a world that is unequal for it to provide justice for them, because we're already having continuous crises that we are facing, other injustices like racism, institutionally embedded inequality, and also access to land, especially if you're looking at post-colonial societies who have been completely removed from their indigenous homelands and put into communal reserves that are now reaching a point of overcapacitation and are unable to protect these people. And so many are being forced to move up onto higher plateaus. But because of the laws that constitute and govern some of these countries, it's very difficult to find a new piece of land for them to go to. So I really believe we need to find a way to scale between the vulnerable and the valuable. A very important question, a very important thing to consider also is that for us from the global south, especially from Africa, when we hear of an existential threat, it is a nostalgic feeling because it's not the first time we feel like this. If one considers industrial revolutions through the source of energy, one can almost argue that the first industrial revolutions were basically based on kinetic energy that would come from people working on plantations and all of these colonial narratives which have extorted and exploited them to a certain extent. And now that we've moved into more modern forms of industrial revolutions, they still left behind in terms of ownership of this technology. So the very first important fact for me is order and structure. I believe that's very key in meeting an effective form of climate justice. Without order and structure and respect for the rule of law, it makes it very difficult for the most vulnerable voices to be heard, because they can often just be ignored or played out by those with much bigger power and financial capacity. Borrowing from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change preambular statement for humankind, it thus means we have to make sure that no one should feel left out. And at this particular point of time, a lot of us feel left out from the conversation. Looking at Agenda 21, which has given us a plan of action on how to go about with sustainable development, I'd like to focus on Section 3 and Section 4. Section 3 in particular speaks about major groups, from which Dalee for the indigenous communities comes from, and I myself as a young person would also find ourselves therein. However, these constituencies need to be remodeled because they are often at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to climate negotiations. They often only give their recommendations at the end and parties go first. And I think we need to find a way to restructure these constituencies so that their voices are not stuck therein. Another issue I also think that's missing from the system is, if you understand the climate negotiations, parties are divided in what they call Annex 1, non-Annex 1 countries, and then Annex 2. Now, out of all these three, I think we need a fourth one that is composed of the most vulnerable groups, because it's very difficult for all these vulnerable countries, which are hotspots right now, and we know they are facing the impact as we speak, to actually have their voices heard when they are being forced to negotiate within a vacuum of a lot of other groups who also have to push their interests. So thinking about that could help a lot in identifying how to engage the vulnerable groups and not force them in negotiation bodies that often first look over and at their priorities. And then the second one on Section 4 is means of implementation. For us in the global south, we don't have very good access to education for climate change. And I'm of the opinion that we need to foster free climate education, especially starting with the low-hanging fruits like disaster risk reduction or GIS knowledge. Most of this knowledge is often seated in private education systems that are hard to access, and the people who need the information immediately often don't have that access. This also is complemented by development and transfer of technology, because in the negotiations, they say the transfer of technology will be taken care of, but there was no mention that we still have to buy this technology because it's pretty expensive for most of these poor countries. And most of them have to now choose between drip irrigation, drought relief, or social inequalities that they were already trying to fix. So it takes away from a big chunk of their GDP and other national agendas. Another issue to probably integrate is the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacity, so that we can ensure that everybody has a fair amount and is equally sharing the burden. Because it's very difficult for nations that are developing to not utilize the remaining atmospheric budget and be told that they should completely jump over onto green technology, but they don't have the means to do so. So if they are not supported to convert and transition justly towards green technologies, most of them could be forced to look into the hydrocarbon resources that they possess, and that could create a bit of a problem for us. One big example I have is I find it awkward when people come to a very poor place and choose to put millions of dollars in in a forest right next to it, and the community that's living in poverty is often overlooked. I think effective climate justice means bridging both the environment and the humans together, so that one does not become more important than the other. That way, we don't become an enemy of development, because there's a risk. People from poor countries could think that this agenda that we are trying to bring forward of a greener, more sustainable world is only targeted towards slowing down their development. And one of the ways to deal with that is to acknowledge both the people and the environment as a package, and that could make it a bit easy. In the last quarter of my 10 minutes, I'd like to also focus on my favorite principle, the intergenerational equity, which is surrounding us, the young generations, because currently we feel our ability to sustain ourselves in the future is already being compromised. And often the youth agenda has been controlled or focused in specific parts of the climate agenda, such as Article 6 of the UNFCCC, which is often known as Action for Climate Empowerment, Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, Article 10 of the Kyoto Protocol, and other agreements like the Marrakesh Accords. And I think there's a need to expand beyond this and look at young people through the lens of the whole climate change regime, and not only through mobilization, public engagement, and so-called making a noise. I believe that it's time that we also look at the intergenerational ability that young people possess in order to support. Because if we don't learn how to control and how to sustain ourselves now, we may just reverse everything that is being worked on right now. Another important issue is to bring financial mechanisms closer to the people, because it's still very much a competitive process for you to get funding from institutions like the Green Climate Fund. You need to make sure that your proposal is well written. And I think when you look at countries that are most vulnerable now, especially African economies, it's very difficult for us to still compete and write a good proposal when we already don't have very good technicalities on writing this proposal. So that's like gambling with people's lives. And I think the closer the financial mechanisms are to the people, the easier they'll be able to respond, and also faster to the issues at hand. In this particular narrative, I'm basically arguing for a collaborative inquiry, as they call it, for some type of intelligence that respects and acknowledges everybody and everyone else's opinions and perspectives. In most cases, effective climate justice is reliant upon the courts and a strong judiciary system. And I've seen at national level, most climate change committees often lack the part of the justice systems, and they don't have judiciaries partaking in the nationally determined contributions conversations. And I think it's time we start bringing in that aspect in order to make sure that justice is embedded in every single process and procedure that is taken. That is one of the ways we could actually bring peace to the people and hope to the people, because currently as we speak, especially the young generation, they are in a state of panic and they are not too sure. Most of them have to change their careers. Most of them have to change their aspirations in life just to choose options that will make the world a better place. And I think based on those issues, it's very important to integrate the young and future generations without looking at them as a source or tool, but a means of empowerment. I think I went over my mark there, so I'll just end there for now and just give other people.
Thank you, Deon. That was terrific. Again, lots of interesting thoughts and inspiring ideas there. We've got some questions that have come in, but I'd like to abuse my prerogative really by asking what to me is the question around the effective part of climate change. I mean, we've seen the world generally becoming less equal. There are exceptions to that, though we're seeing there is obviously a lot of injustice in the world. There probably has always been a lot of injustice in the world. And it has to be said that even before we were aware of climate change, powerful people very often didn't do very much to make the world more just, and very often they did exactly the opposite. So my question is that we know that climate change of itself is a mechanism of injustice, especially intergenerational injustice, which is what you were saying, Deon. Do you see in climate change itself an opportunity to actually reinforce those forces that are working for greater justice in the world? Or do you just think this is going to make the whole issue of justice that much more difficult? So Dalee, why don't we start with you with that one?
Well, I think that, as I've said, but also reinforced by Deon in a very, very elucidating fashion, that the challenges that we face, and especially for Indigenous peoples, when it comes to the issue of justice and effective climate justice, that the system from first contact was imbalanced. If you think about the impacts of climate change, if you think about what Deon has raised in terms of the equal application of the rule of law, that has been out of balance from the beginning. This approach of colonization and superiority has put Indigenous peoples outside the door, and all of our work has been to pry open the door to remove the inequities, and hence the term climate justice. I think that it's going to take a multi-pronged approach, which Deon has very articulately expressed, that the address of access to financial resources, the embrace and the inclusion of young people, the inclusion of Indigenous peoples. I think that the hurdles are very tall, and to clear them is going to take a pretty concerted effort in order to achieve greater justice, as you ask. At the same time, though, I think that the world community, and in particular beyond governments, are recognizing that they have to act, and this is where I see the opportunity for really nurturing and cultivating opportunities for greater justice, that maybe not necessarily the structures that now exist. And I think Deon rightly pointed out the need to reform these structures to ensure that there is an embrace and an affirmation of diverse views, whether it's youth or Indigenous peoples, the role of women within communities, and so forth, are actually afforded within these systems. So I think that the opportunities exist, but the major transformation has to take place in all dimensions. Thank you.
Great. No, that's a lovely response. And Deon, I mean, has climate justice made the work of the justice movement, if I can call it that, more difficult, or does it provide new opportunities? And I ask that really, you know, we've seen COVID in the UK anyway has shown up just how unequal our own society is. And when people say we're all in this together, I just, you know, that's absolutely not true. Some people are being really targeted by what's happening, and others are surviving more or less okay. So, and similarly, it's possible that the climate issue will put into such high relief the injustices in the world that it will provide an opportunity. So what's your perspective on that?
Thank you, Paul. I like how you compared the vaccine issue as a just issue as well, or the COVID issue, because if you even look at the supplies of vaccines, the poorer the country or the state of economy actually defines or dictates how much access you'll have to these vaccines. And if you think about it, addressing climate justice can give us an opportunity to address a lot of other injustices. I will take, for example, my country, which is a post-apartheid state. reductions in carbon emissions do not necessarily equate to an improvement in economic status. The way to argue is that just because we abolished apartheid did not mean though Namibia or South Africa became equal. In fact, we're still living with the consequences of apartheid. And one of those is access to land. And so using climate justice, for example, to move a particular vulnerable group of people who are on a particular land that is not capable enough to withstand climate impacts gives us the chance to bring land to the people that they previously didn't have, and also put them in a place that makes them safe from climate impacts. So essentially, this is $1 trillion question. What is the incentive and what are the opportunities in transitioning to a sustainable world for poorer and more developing nations? It's not easy to answer, I would definitely say that, because injustices come at different levels, and also measures to meet those through justice is also not necessarily the same for different states. Like, we have a lot of islands, but not all small islands have the same capacity to respond. Some are in a better position than others. So for me, essentially, I would argue that we have to maybe look at it beyond a epistemological perspective and look into metaphysics as well, into trying to answer this question, because there's a bit of philosophy that carries itself within the question of effective climate justice. And that type of approach would eventually lead us to what the indigenous communities call spiritual knowledge, or some type of greater connection with Mother Nature. Because at the end of the day, our greatest example for justice would always be nature. The way she distributes resources and the way she governs has actually shown us that we don't need to dig too deep sometimes to actually get these basic answers. They're already there. And just like me being an African, we are taught that when you grow up, you take care of the small ones while you're older, so that when you get old, the small ones, when they get older, they'll take care of you. And so these principles and ethics and moral virtues are missing from the climate justice issue. It's too centered around market economies and reduction of greenhouse gases, and often overlooks the livelihoods, the aspirations, and just the whole composition of those particular places that are being impacted. So I'd probably answer it like that, to say that the opportunities lie in looking beyond technology and markets alone, and looking at what contributions can each bring to the table, because we all agreed we need a collaborative approach to it. And getting to that part is a bit difficult, because some voices are not heard, other voices are louder than others. Other people have the freedom to leave agreements that people have worked hard to come together on. And I think as long as those little issues are allowed to happen, it'll be very difficult for us, because we cannot rely on the kindness of somebody to give back people's right to life or development. This is more an issue of putting away our selfish desires and subordinating that for the collective benefit of everybody. I hope I answered a little bit. But,
yeah, no, sure. There's no easy answer to these questions. I mean, these are questions that we need to explore, and as you say, they're philosophical right the way through and through. I've got two questions from our audience now, one for each of you, and I'm going to read them in turn. So the first one is for you, Dalee. This is from Rebecca Morris, and she asks, since climate change is a global issue with impacts being felt as a result of actions miles and miles away, how can we get those in power to listen to indigenous communities that are most vulnerable to climate change? So that's your question. And I'm going to read the second question for Dalee, because for Deon, I'm sorry, because it's quite similar, but it's from a youth perspective this time. And this is from Gaia De Luca. And she says, I'm usually told that we, meaning young people, she says, I'm a young activist, so I'm usually told that we are the future of the society. I've had many opportunities to dialogue with lawmakers, but nothing changed in my small reality. Young people are not yet decision makers. How can we get adults, leaders, politicians to actually take action today and mitigate the effect of climate justice in a just way? So those are two questions from different perspectives about this business of how to get people to listen and to take action that will improve climate justice from the perspective of Indigenous people and the perspective of young people. Over to you, Dalee.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that indeed that is exactly the work of the Inuit Circumpolar Council as an international Indigenous peoples organization, that the whole effort to educate the world community, not just in the context of the political arena of climate change, but in every interrelated intergovernmental fora, we have been working to educate people about our distinct status, our distinct rights, our distinct role in all of these discussions, whether it's economic development, social development, political development, spiritual development, cultural development. Our work has been to inform and educate others about the unique Arctic environment and our place within that environment. I think it's quite extraordinary that individuals like former ICC President Sheila Watt-Cloutier helped to put the human face onto the impacts of climate change, that she brought human beings into the dialogue about greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, often addressed solely from a hard science point of view and perspective. And I think that what Deon has said about the worldviews and perspectives of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge and our profound relationship with our environment, these important characteristics of who we are and our cultural identity are at the heart of educating others about the approaches that are really necessary for countering climate change and countering its impacts through, again, our ability to observe the impacts and to consider, based upon Indigenous knowledge, our responses to the impacts. I think it's also important to recognize that, and I think that Deon was really saying this and messaging this, that for Indigenous peoples and for Inuit, we are the originators of sustainable development. You know, it's funny that we now have a whole, agenda and the SDGs and all this activity related to sustainable development. If you think about the customs and practices of Indigenous peoples, not only in the Arctic among Inuit and Sami, but around the entire globe, we have demonstrated sustainable development for centuries. And so it's kind of ironic that now the United Nations and others are looking at the issue of sustainable development. And before I conclude, I think it's important also for the rest of the world community to recognize that in the context of Indigenous peoples, there is this false dichotomy between the North and the South. And many are of the view, especially in the climate change context and within the UNFCCC, that those in the North, have access and benefits. And in relation to who is most vulnerable, and in the case of Indigenous people specifically, we don't have the same access, hence climate justice and the need for climate justice. So this false dichotomy of the, again, in the context of Indigenous peoples in the North and in the South, has to be dispensed with. Indigenous peoples in the most affluent countries in the world are still marginalized, still face an infrastructure deficit that I spoke of in my opening remarks. And these gaps and these disparities need to be recognized in every context, including in the context of climate justice. And that's really what has compelled us to become involved in the work of the UNFCCC and to amplify our voices within every fora that we possibly can to educate people about its impacts. And I think that we have thus far been very successful, largely in part due to the very compelling images that we see about the loss of sea ice, the loss of glaciers and ice melt, which then opens up additional challenges like increased vessel traffic across the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. And here again, we have to say that, wait a second, these so-called new opportunities as recognized by the shipping industry, they will have devastating effects on our communities who are reliant upon that sea ice, who are reliant upon that marine environment for their food security, which then in turn ensures our physical health, our mental health, all of these different interrelated aspects. So I don't know that I've answered the question, but I think that the human dimension is really important in our effort to educate the rest of the world community as to the impacts on people at the micro level. And of course, it has multiple elements and dimensions. But our effort at the ICC is to bring our faces and our voices to the fora where we believe we can make a difference to not only end the adverse impacts, but also to make the contributions that we can based upon our knowledge and our perspectives. So
right. Okay. No, thank you very much. That's a really interesting answer. Deon, over to you. So you've heard sort of what the indigenous strategies might be, some of the actions there. What would you say on behalf of the youth movement in respect of how do you get powerful adults to pay attention?
Thank you for the question. Perhaps I'd like to start with a poem in Africa that says, if you want to go fast, or if you want to move fast, then you should go alone. But if the most important logic is that we as young people must for not being disorganized, because climate change and youth is synonymously becoming very important in, let me say, the last 5 years, so to speak. And one of the problems I've seen with us as young people, we often tend to be all over the place, and we don't make use of our skills and assets that we possess so that we are better divided in there. For example, maybe as young people, we should look into those who are interested in, we should divide ourselves along the science, the negotiations, and then the actions. Because sometimes we don't even have enough youth representation in spaces like the IPCC, which one would actually expect a lot of youth in there. If you go to negotiations, there's very, very few young people who are formal delegates carrying the pink badge and able to enter strategic and very important meetings during the COPs. And most young people carry the yellow observer badge, which already makes 50% of your work very difficult to bring through when you're at a climate negotiation. And then the last part that I've seen we've been very good at is action on the ground in mobilizing the public and bringing people together, mass tree plantations and other climate initiatives that we carry out. A combination of all three would be very important for the youth agenda so that we move in unison in all sectors, as opposed to only focusing on one area, which is often the action, but action without a plan is not really sustainable. And so even if you ask me today, what is the youth agenda on climate change, I will probably give you a lot of different responses, because there isn't really something we've come to sit down with. But in recent times, I've seen a lot of appetite from institutions looking into integrating young people. And that's why me participating in the first ever UN Youth Summit last year, and also hopefully this year we see a lot around the Italian government and the United Kingdom hosting COP26, also looking into having young people present at the Youth COP. And this is the first time that young people are actually being given a seat at the table. In my experience, I remember at COP23, we were negotiating for action for climate empowerment. And we as the young people felt, well, this entire agenda speaks to the work we do: public engagement, public training, education, access to information. This is more or less the root cause of our work. So we felt compelled to engage the decision makers or the negotiators that why don't we participate in this workshop? And I'll tell you, we had a lot of challenges. Some states felt like, why should we put young people above others? And if we bring in the youth, we need to bring in women, we need to bring in that. And so it was a bit tough. And most of our fellow youth colleagues did not carry the pink badge. But one of the strategies we set out to do is we engage, for example, the African group of negotiators together with the G77. And we then spoke to them about how we actually wish to bring the youth agenda at this workshop so that we are not left out, especially those who aren't able to travel. And long story short, they eventually found some text from the New Delhi Work Program, which helped us stand a chance for the parties to agree. And the year after, in 2018, I think they gave some fund. That was one of the first times I've seen young people inside the negotiations successfully get something out of it. So it's not going to come freely. Nobody's just going to give us that on a silver platter. We're going to have to work for it. But more often than not, we should stop asking for permission and start taking ownership of the process. Because sometimes it's that some decision makers just don't think young people have anything to add. Others have a different view. If you study the literature on youth engagement in this UNFCCC or climate change negotiations, you'll see one of our weaknesses is that we often rely on symbolic and representative gestures around we're representing the future generations, we deserve to be at the table, but we need to go a little bit further from that and have more categorical propositions that actually help create impact immediately on the ground for young people at home. When parties are signing agreements for big renewable energy technology projects in developing nations or others, rarely do we, the youth, come there to argue, how about our counterparts in that state? Are they gonna be involved? And where are we in this process? And we're often missing from that. So we need to form stronger allies because we are often reliant upon the relationship with decision makers. The longer you have a relationship with the decision maker, the easier it is to get them to agree to something. If you just appear the very first time, it makes it really difficult for them to agree and follow on our agendas. So we need to be consistent at a local level, following all the way through to an international level. And that's where we can support. But the question in itself is a question I think that is being answered over time as to how we integrate young people and what does youth empowerment actually mean. It means different things in different places. Cultural values also play a role. In some places, children or young ones are not allowed to speak to elders. And so you're not even invited at a particular meeting. Just picture a climate change, community-based adaptation meeting under a tree in a very rural setting. Most of the time, the young one will not say much because the culture there is that you must not speak when the elders speak. And in other places, they really welcome youth and they allow them to speak. And so a combination of all this would be very important for us in order to ensure that all young people are given the chance. If I may, one of the things that breaks my heart is how I see some young people living in very deplorable conditions, but still every morning they wake up active and interested to contribute. Some sleep on floors, but they wake up with a better climate in mind. And they have to choose sometimes between money for data so that they can go online, or are they gonna go buy food? And so they're like, well, if I don't attend that meeting, the voices of my people probably not be there. So it's not so easy. It's very important for the youth agenda to eventually become an agenda item in the UNFCCC negotiations. It's never been yet. And when we get to those spaces and places, it makes it very easier for some parties to actually adopt and support the youth agenda. But yeah,
You've suddenly gone on mute, Deon. So, but we'll leave it there. We've only got a very few minutes left, and we've got lots of fascinating questions that have come in. So I'm going to ask our speakers, these are really difficult questions, but if you can answer them as briefly as possible, we can get through as many questions as we can. So we've got a question here from Annabelle von Moltke. It was Dalee who mentioned food security. It was Deon who talked about choosing between data and eating. She's passionate about climate justice. She's been looking into the concepts of food sovereignty and food security. Obviously, the implications of climate change for food sovereignty and food security are extremely serious. She says that she's mainly seen these used in the global South, food sovereignty in the global South, and food security more in the global North and international organizations. And it was interesting that Dalee used the term food security. Is one of these concepts more just than the other, and why? So how do you feel about the language around food sovereignty and food security?
Well, I think that they are intimately linked. And as I said at the outset of my initial intervention, we are so intimately tied with our environment and our reliance upon, especially the marine environment, that this issue of food security is one of the areas most impacted. And I think that the issue of food sovereignty goes also to my point about the significance and the importance of our right of self-determination in relation to our food security, as well as the management of the resources and the environment, the ecosystems that we depend upon. Because of colonized policies that have shoved a wedge between indigenous peoples and access to their lands, territories, and resources, but even more significantly, the right to those lands, territories, and resources, and our extraordinary capacity for sustainable development and management, so-called management, which is actually only related to human beings, not really to the environment or to ecosystems, that capacity for sustainable development, for the management and the governance, the food sovereignty that Annabelle is speaking of has been hindered by policies. So for Inuit, certainly in Alaska, this needs to be addressed in a comprehensive fashion that ensures that we don't create a greater separation, and that the wedge between the peoples and their environment and ecosystems isn't increased, but rather that in order to achieve food security, we need food sovereignty. I hope that's responsive to her question.
Very interesting. Deon, food.
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. For me, I see food security as the ability to store and secure supplies of food, or ensure that your supplies are not in some type of trouble. Whereas food sovereignty to me sounds like you're still fighting for the right to be able to store some food. In this regard, I mean, a lot of places in Africa are under conflict, destabilization, and that makes it really difficult for one to think about the food agenda, because there's a thin line between peace without food and food without peace. And if you look at the ability to produce food in Africa, it's quite huge because of the arability of the land. But then the question becomes, why is Africa unable to feed herself when there's so much land available? But I guess that comes back to the issue of climate as well. because we have a huge rain-fed agriculture dependency. And if it doesn't rain necessarily, people don't have that access. In most places where I come from, my continent, the grazing field is like the shopping mall or the grocery store for most people. If it does not rain, you almost have no harvest. And we have a lot of people being forced to kill a lot of their cattle because of extended drought. And in other parts of the world, if it doesn't rain, it's not really a concern, because as long as you have money, you're able to go to a store and purchase some supplies. So for us in Africa, we're very more concerned with I think it's Article 2 of the UN Convention that speaks about ensuring that carbon emissions do not destabilize the food production systems. And so we are not even at a position to actually have a conversation around food security yet. We first need to ensure that we have the right to actually affordable food as well, because some people also have market principles that dictate how much access you have to this food. And maybe I should add something there for Annabelle, if she allows me. We also have a problem with the kind of food they used to eat for millennia. It's food that has been introduced to our cultures through colonization. And some of it comes from other continents and is entirely reliant upon different ecosystems and climates. And so it makes it difficult for us to produce a sufficient amount for people while overlooking the natural indigenous food that is already, one, adaptable to the climate because it's been around for so long, and two, we can also grow it at a higher propensity rate than we do with other imports. So the question of food, I think, is a little bit complex, and it requires also, there's also injustices there in itself. So, but I like how she brought it up. I think I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you. No, well, indeed. Everything here is pretty complex, it seems to me. I've been told I can go on a couple of minutes, and I'm glad about that, because the last set of issues I want to raise are two questions which have come up, which are quite similar in some ways. Let me see, I've just got to make sure that I can find this. You can see there's been so many questions here. So this is a question from Isabella Campion, and she writes, to what extent do you think that granting rights to nature, with guardians acting on behalf of nature, can help to achieve climate justice for indigenous communities? So I guess that's one especially for you, Dalee, and speaks very much to sort of indigenous ways of life, I guess. And then she gives an example. I'm thinking of the Whanganui River in New Zealand as a model where the river was given legal personality with a guardian from the local Maori tribe appointed to act on its behalf. And while you're just thinking about that, I'll ask a second question, which I guess you might like to think about, Deon. And this comes from Rachel Killian. I would welcome both panelists' views, so obviously Dalee is invited to answer this one too, on the role of criminal law and a possible future law of ecocide, if you have any views on that. And clearly there's a little bit of momentum building behind that idea of ecocide. And Deon, you spoke particularly about the importance of the rule of law and of order in your initial remarks. So I'm going to ask you to address that one, and perhaps I could start with you, and then I'll go to Dalee and ask her to address both questions.
Thank you, Rachel. I think climate litigation or environmental litigation has also seen a speedily increase. I think we just saw a report from the United Nations Environment Program. I think it was released 2 days back. But using my perspective where I come from, I have seen proposals from young graduates in the law fraternity that proposed environmental tribunals, and to argue that at the community level, we need to, because we have a lot of communal land issues that often come into conflict with private initiatives like private game reserves and access to these resources. So that was one of the more unique ideas I've seen being proposed, but I've not seen being implemented. there is also the issue of an environmental lawyer society network that was formed by some graduates here at home who are also trying to advocate for the environment. It comes back to my initial point that I don't see the judiciary very much involved when it comes to the environmental issues. And if you go to the courts and present your case often to them, they only use the process that they're used to. It's rare that a judge would be biased towards an environmental issue. And I would probably argue that it is not only very important, but it's probably about time the world starts to consider it. Because we have, for example, human-wildlife conflict in Namibia. We have the largest group of black rhinos and also the second largest of white rhinos left. We've got a lot of massive amounts of elephants, and due to the climate reduction of grazing land for them and water, they are forced to come closer into human settlements, and that has caused a lot of conflict. But these animals don't really have rights. What often happens is that an order is just given that this animal is being a problem and it needs to be put down. And I won't mind seeing something around protecting the rights of the environment as well, because for me, I always argue that it's us humans that change. It's not the elephants. The elephants never went to no school or any social conditioning process. They are the same since they were created. It's us humans that change our ways. In fact, there's an indigenous group called the Khoisan in Namibia, where I come from. And these groups were once upon a time in good contact with the environment. So much so that if they ran into particular threat, I don't know what they were saying specifically, but there were certain terminologies or words they would use that would keep them at peace, and the lion would satisfyingly say, no, look, I'm gonna go that side and you guys can go that side. And I don't know how they did it, but that is an issue of giving those animals rights to argue that they are not as human beings perceive them to be, that they are just wild and they don't have a system of governance and they are just out there to multiply and take over the human settlements. And I think an environmental agenda that looks into protecting their rights, but that would require a lot of indigenous perspectives too, because the indigenous communities often understand how to engage with this wildlife. And I've seen it happen over and over, but I've not seen, for example, I find it weird that we still refer to the lion as a Leopanthera. We have plants called aloe vera, and in our languages, we already had names for them. And yet the disparity and the disconnection is becoming more and more. So for us to have a proper, strong law against ecocide, we need to also connect human beings back to the environment so that we can understand what the environment's needs are as opposed to our needs. Because right now we are developing the environment for our own benefit, whereas sometimes the environment also deserves its own space and right to exist. So it comes back to metaphysics too. It's not so simple because the code and the laws are often not geared towards protecting them. But perhaps for our generations moving forward, these are very quintessential and fundamental questions we should consider. So I do agree with it. It just requires a lot of discussions, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Deon. Yes, I don't think we're going there anytime soon. But Dalee, you've got a background in international law. So granting rights to natural features, to rivers, ecocide, what are the prospects for that, and how might it happen?
Yeah, I think that it's a really difficult question, especially from an indigenous perspective. And my earlier comments about this extraordinary and profound relationship that we have to the environment. For Inuit and many other indigenous peoples, recognizing that you are also a species within the environment, that you have a relationship with the ecosystem that surrounds you. And it's a very intimate and profound relationship. And so the notion of granting rights to nature becomes a very complicated if in fact you and your worldview and perspective is that you're a part of that environment. And one reason why I kind of shy away from this discussion about rights to nature, which by the way has been raised by, in particular, the government of Bolivia within the context of the UNFCCC, which ended up spawning, for example, discussion and dialogue about the local communities and indigenous peoples platform within the UNFCCC, is that there is a danger and we've seen it by governments in the past, of identifying conservation areas, identifying World Heritage sites according to the UNESCO World Heritage Convention and so forth, in order to remove the indigenous peoples from their traditional and inherent lands, territories, and resources. And so it seems to me that we have to be extremely careful about the idea of granting rights to nature. If we think about the Maori example that Isabella spoke to, I think the operative word here is the Maori, right? And their relationship to that watershed, their relationship to that specific ecosystem, and their long-standing ability and capacity to live in a harmonious and sustainable fashion with that watershed, that this can't be interfered with by, to some extent, a human construct. Like a legal personality for a watershed. So I can see the benefit. I can see the advances that could be made and defined. But I think even more significantly, the Maori as indigenous peoples, the Inuit as indigenous peoples, and this sacred relationship, if there were greater efforts by government and others to recognize the fundamental human rights that are inherent or pre-existing for indigenous peoples, that we would be at a place where we wouldn't be compelled to talk about the rights of nature. In fact, we would be able to open up this political and intellectual space to really advance our knowledge and our intricate knowledge of our surrounding environment and the ecosystems that we are a part of. With regard to Rachel's question about criminal law and ecocide, if one reads the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is an important international human rights instrument that took indigenous peoples over 25 years to negotiate within the UN system. So if you think about that for a moment, all those state parties in the UNFCCC should be adhering to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That declaration includes a right to the productive capacity of your lands, territories, and resources as indigenous peoples. So really, how is it that we're going to potentially shift all of these elements into effectively a right to a safe and healthy environment, not just for indigenous peoples, but for all peoples? I think that there is some merit to the possibilities of development of criminal law in this context. But again, I would have to go to the heart of the efforts of indigenous peoples to ensure that their worldviews and their perspectives are coming through in terms of what they determine to be the productive capacity of their lands, territories, and resources, their right to a safe and healthy environment, again, from their holistic worldviews and perspectives. And for those that are committing ecocide, I think that there's a huge need to remind them that these standards do exist. And in regard to a safe and healthy environment, you know, this is being further developed and developed in the context of the progressive development of law, the progressive development of international law. And really it comes down to governments respecting and recognizing their legal obligations to indigenous peoples and to others, and really putting into play what exists presently in terms of international human rights standards and norms. They're all out there. They exist. We contributed to them in an effective an intellectually honest fashion. And if in fact governments and other third parties, corporations and otherwise, would adhere to, affirm, respect, and recognize these international norms and standards, we would all be much better off. But it's important to have that political will, and on the part of governments, the political will to hold those responsible for such actions of ecocide and other criminal activity, hold their feet to the fire in concrete, effective ways, so that we don't have to rely upon an additional human construct of development of criminal law in this way. I wish we weren't having the conversation. I think it's fascinating. I myself have not spent enough time studying this dimension of the issue of climate change impacts, but I suppose that it is important to give a nod to, again, my friend and colleague Sheila Watt-Cloutier, who wrote the book, The Right to Be Cold, and offering an Inuit perspective as to the importance of us taking climate justice to the Indigenous world through our work. So I hope I've been responsive to both the questions that have been said.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and a very good place to end, actually. Lots of other questions here we'd have liked to have taken about the accountability issue and people being accountable for justice and injustice and reform of the UN institutions and all that kind of stuff. We've gone on much longer than we should have done, but I was told I could do that, and it's because your questions and your conversation was so fascinating and so interesting. So thank you both very much indeed, Dalee, Deon. All the very best in your incredibly important work that you're doing, often, I know, under very difficult circumstances. And so I can only wish all power to your elbow, and there have been lots of comments in the chat along those lines. So thanking you for your perspectives, your insights, and hoping that together we all make some progress on these very important issues. So thanks also to the audience, the participants, for attending. Hope it's been good. Do go and see the exhibition at the British Museum when you're allowed to, because obviously it's tricky just at the moment. But yeah, and thank you. In the UK, good night and goodbye, and hopefully see you again soon. Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye.